Alright, what's going on, guys? Today, we are going to attempt to make a budget version of Affinity called Blast Affinity. This also happens to be the deck that I play at my local gaming store, so if you want to see what I get up to in paper when I go in for Modern, well, this is it. Now, if you're a regular of the channel, you know that we've already done a budget Affinity deck. However, the purpose of that deck was to test to see if the combination of Ensoul Artifact and Tezzer's Touch was playable in Modern. It did okay, I guess. With this deck, however, we're looking to build a deck that actually functions like an Affinity deck, just without all the really expensive stuff that, well, frankly, that makes Affinity actually playable, right? So first off, we're going to start with the Affinity Aggro package, which includes cards like Memnite, Ornithopter, and Springleaf Drum. So the benefit of these is that we get lots of free artifacts. Memnite and Ornithopter both cost 0 mana, and although Springleaf Drum costs 1, so long as we have one of the two creatures, we can tap them for mana, thus making the drum kind of free, in a sense. We then want things like Vault Scourge, Signal Pest, and our big payoff card, Cranial Plating. Vault Scourge is a great 1-drop. We have to pay 2 life to cast it, but we almost always gain that life back, and possibly even more. Signal Pest has Battle Cry, so it makes playing all of these hyper-aggressive artifact creatures even better by pumping them up on attacking. And the Cranial Plating is the game ender, giving a creature +X/+0, where X is the number of artifacts we control. That's typically between 3 to 5 on turn 2 at the very least. It really isn't uncommon for this package to result in massive amounts of combat damage as early as turn 2. For example, if we could play Darksteel Citadel and Ornithopter on turn 1, and then pay 1 for a Springleaf Drum, then tap the drum and the Ornithopter to play Vault Scourge, we go down to 18 and we have a few artifacts in play. Then on turn 2 we play a land, we tap 2 for Cranial Plating, we tap the drum and the Thopter to equip the plating to the Vault Scourge, and then we're swinging for 6 damage in the air with Lifelink on turn 2. I know that doesn't seem likely, but remember we have 8 0-cost creatures, and it doesn't have to be a Vault Scourge, it can be a Signal Pest, it could just be an Ornithopter. Basically, we just get a whole lot of damage on turn 2, provided we draw a Cranial Plating, which is our big payoff card. Alternatively, we could play a bunch of these artifacts and get a Master of Ethereum, which has power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts we control, and also gives all of our stuff +1/+1. And again, all of that on turn 2. So yeah, we can get off to a blistering start, and all on a pretty low budget. The problem is, we can't play the really good stuff in Affinity. The stuff that makes Affinity a tier 1 deck. Things like Mox Opal, Arcbound Ravager, and Steel Overseer. The Mox Opal gives us an additional free artifact and an additional free mana, so we get 2 available mana on turn 1 and potentially 4 mana on turn 2 if we get like a Springleaf Drum and a 0-cost creature alongside it. This is what allows Affinity to have such massively explosive turn 1 plays in competitive games. It's just, it's a lot of mana, it's a free artifact, it's kind of crazy. The Arcbound Ravager is a powerhouse. It adds resiliency by turning any dead artifact into a +1/+1 counter, which can then be dumped on an Ornithopter as an extra way to create a massive deadly flyer. In addition to the Cranial Plating, it also complicates the battlefield because it can get up to all kinds of shenanigans during combat. And finally, it's an alternate win condition when paired with Inkmoth Nexus, which has Infect, so Ravager can just dump a bunch of +1/+1 counters on it, and you can go for a poison kill, which happens quite regularly. And then finally, Steel Overseer just gives the deck another payoff for going wide by dumping a bunch of +1/+1 counters on everything you control. This thing gets crazy if you have a giant pile of low-cost artifact creatures in play, not to mention the Nexuses that can animate and collect counters themselves. So yeah, these cards are pretty awesome. Unfortunately, we can't play any of them, as all of these are incredibly expensive. I'm playing this deck in paper, and in USD these cards would cost a whopping $650. Yeah, that's why I play on a budget. So, how do we adequately replace these? Well, the truth is, we can't. Not really, anyway. But what we can do is, kind of plug the holes with things that do an adequate job of finishing the game for us. Because that is the problem with the base Affinity Aggro package. You see, once we remove all of these expensive cards, Affinity does one of two things. It either draws a cranial plating and pummels the opponent to a pulp in 3 or 4 turns, or else it rips through the opponent's life total and then they stabilize and win. Every single time. So, let's give Budget Affinity some reach. Maybe with Galvanic Blast and Shrapnel Blast. Reach is what these cards give us, because they do massive amounts of damage with very low mana costs. Galvanic Blast usually does 4 damage for a single mana, and Shrapnel Blast does 5 damage for 2 at instant speed, provided that we sacrifice an artifact. Now, sacrificing an artifact is not what we want to do in an Affinity deck, but we hold it up and we use it to respond to removal spells. So basically anything that dies, it kind of works like an Arcbound Ravager. You kill something of mine, you're going to take 5 damage. And we don't technically lose an artifact if we're responding to a removal spell anyway. We're going to lose it anyway, so why not get 5 damage out of it? I know this doesn't seem like much, but look at it this way. If we get just a couple of these in a game, we are literally guaranteed to have 8 to 10 damage worth of burn with just 2 cards. It literally cuts our opponent's life total in half. All we need to do is, 10 to 12 damage, possibly less, and that's easy peasy for Affinity. Assuming we don't just draw a cranial plating and win, we should be able to do 10 damage with, Signal Pests and Vault Scourges and Ornithopters and whatnot, at which point we just fire off a couple blast spells to finish our opponent off, which is exactly what the budget version of Affinity was missing. So, yeah, that's some reach. These spells give us some reach. So, with all of that out of the way, let's take a super quick look at the actual deck list. We're playing 4 copies each of the entire Affinity Aggro package, which includes Vault Scourge, Ornithopter, Mimnite, Signal Pest, Springleaf Drum, and Cranial Plating. We're also going to play 4 copies each of our Blast spells, Galvanic Blast and Shrapnel Blast, for the reach. This is also, by the way, why the deck is called Blast Affinity. After that, we're going to play 1 copy of Hope of Girapur and 3 copies of Master of Ethereum. We're literally just playing the Hope of Girapur because it's a 1 mana 1/1 with flying. It does come with the added benefit of being able to prevent our opponents from casting non-creature spells if we sacrifice it after it damages them. That can definitely, sometimes be relevant, because if our opponent is on the ropes, we can sacrifice it and prevent our opponent from, maybe playing a sorcery speed board sweeper. So, every once in a while it will be relevant, but for the most part, we're just looking for a 1 mana 1/1 flying artifact. And that's it. The Master of Ethereums are kind of great. It does double duty for us, because it pumps up our swarm of tiny artifact creatures, while also providing us with a very big, beefy ground pounder. This guy is almost always a 5/5 at minimum, and sometimes he's simply gargantuan, so he can stomp out our opponents, or just sit back defensively and prevent our opponent from attacking while we peck and poke with a few small flyers, so, hey, whatever works. We're also going to be playing 3 copies of Thoughtcast, which lets us draw 2 cards, typically for 1 blue mana, since, it has Affinity. Now, I will say that many competitive Affinity decks do not run Thoughtcast because they don't want to spend time drawing cards when they actually just want to go for the kill. And I completely agree with that. I think that's the right move for Tier 1 Affinity. However, we are a little bit jankier and slower than the competitive version of the deck. So Thoughtcast is more worth it for us. It gives us a chance to draw into our 8 blast spells. Casting a Thoughtcast for 1 mana to hit a Galvanic Blast or a Shrapnel Blast is just downright satisfying. So drawing cards is much more worth it for us than the competitive version. So that's why we're running 3 copies of it in this build. And that's it actually. That's the whole thing. The mana base is a little bit more complex than our usual pile of basics. We'll be playing 4 Darksteel Citadels, 4 Spire of Industry, and 3 Cascade Bluffs. The Citadels are great because they count as an artifact. Spire of Industry gives us access to all 5 colors, and it doesn't come into play tapped. And we don't have to pay 1 life to tap it. Most of the time we can just tap it for colorless, and then if we just desperately need that color, then, it's 1 life, so big deal. And the Cascade Bluffs are just a nice budget alternative to fetches and shocks. I should note that the bluffs are much more expensive in paper, to the point where you might as well just buy fetches or shocks. But on Magic Online, the filter lands are fairly cheap for the most part, I think with the exception of 1 or 2 of them, but Cascade Bluffs, it's very cheap, so it'll work for us as a dual land in a budget deck on Magic Online. And after that, yep, just a pile of basics, 5 islands, 5 mountains, you know the drill. So taking a super quick look at the sideboard, we'll be playing 4 Tormod's Crypts for graveyards and 3 Ancient Stirrings for artifacts. Do keep in mind that because we have 4 Spire of Industry and 4 Springleaf Drum, we have a pretty good chance of having access to green mana to pay for the flashback costs, so that's handy. We'll also be playing 2 Spell Pierce for combo decks and 2 Gear per Ether Grids, which allows us to tap 2 artifacts to deal 1 damage to something. It's a workaround for lockdown decks, but it also lets us shoot down opposing flyers, particularly Lingering Souls tokens, which are basically the death of us. With a Gear per Ether Grid, we can just tap a couple lands or, Springleaf Drums, whatever. Shoot the Spirit tokens out of the skies so we can attack with our Vault Scourges and whatnot. So definitely pretty decent. Though speaking of Lingering Souls, Whip Flare is an excellent sideboard option for, anything that puts out lots of 1/1 flyers. So definitely consider that if you're thinking about building this. I'm actually playing 4 copies of Whip Flare in my paper deck, because my playgroup is pretty small, and one of the regulars has a Mardu Pyromancer deck, so just going all in on the Whip Flares in my personal build. Always build your sideboard to the meta, that's an important thing. Lastly, we'll be playing 2 copies of Welding Jar to counter spot removal, and a couple extra Hope of Gear Purrs if those are relevant, or if we just feel like we need to board in more creatures. So yeah, pretty simple. That's it, guys. That's the deck. Basically, the all-in aggro aspect of Affinity with some beefy burn spells to finish off the opponent. That's our strategy, and again, this is the deck that I'm playing at my local gaming store in paper. So yeah, it's decent. It works, kind of. It's definitely not the tier 1 deck. If you're going to a Grand Prix, you need to go out and spend, roughly $1,000 USD on the tier 1 version to have any chance of being competitive. But for us, on a budget, this will have to do for us. So let's give this deck a test. We can talk about it all we want, but let's play it. We'll play 5 games with it in the tournament practice room on Magic Online. And if you want to see those games, as always, check the description. There should be a playlist. And I will see you in the first match.